Good evening. Charles Ponzi was a former waiter, bank teller, and smuggler who was very good decades ago at convincing people he could make them millions, but he kept their money. And while his name lives on to describe a kind of shyster, he was an amateur compared to Bernie Madoff. Madoff apologized today for duping investors out of $50 billion, maybe more, and he was promptly thrown in jail. He will spend, we're told, 23 hours a day in his cell, 1 hour in a cage on top of the roof of the lockup. He will likely die behind bars, and it still won't be enough for some of those he defrauded. Our coverage of his court appearance and incarceration tonight from CNBC's Scott Cohn in Lower Manhattan. Scott, good evening.
Good evening to you, Brian. It may be the most brazen and widespread financial fraud ever, and now Bernard Madoff has begun to pay. But even now, some are wondering if this consummate con man is still trying to game this system. Face to face with justice. Face to face with some of his victims.
What he deserves is for him to be stripped of everything.
As 24 victims listened in the courtroom, some shaking their heads, some in tears, Bernard Madoff stood to profess his guilt. "I am painfully aware that I have deeply hurt many, many people," Madoff read from a prepared statement. "I cannot adequately express how sorry I am for what I have done." Madoff explained that the fraud began during the recession in the early 1990s. Determined to satisfy his clients at any cost, he simply pretended to invest their money in the stock market, using the money instead to pay other investors, a classic Ponzi scheme. Madoff said he thought it would be temporary until the market turned. But once the scam was started, he couldn't stop it. As the years went on, he said, "I realized that my arrest and this day would inevitably come." Victim Bert Ross was unimpressed.
I think the only thing he's sorry about is that he got caught, and we're not sorry he got caught.
When Judge Denny Chin announced he planned to revoke Madoff's bail, the victims broke into applause, and the defendant was placed in handcuffs.
That was pleasurable for a moment, a brief moment.
But questions remain. Throughout his 10-minute speech, Madoff implicated no one else. He said he falsified the trades. He filed bogus statements with regulators. Madoff even claimed that part of his business was legitimate, the brokerage operation run by his brother and sons.
Well, clearly he didn't do this by himself.
Former federal prosecutor Robert Mintz thinks there's more to Madoff's story.
He only talked about his own conduct. He didn't implicate anybody else in a crime that everybody else believes had to have others involved.
Tonight, Bernard Madoff is behind bars. The man who rigged the numbers for years is now inmate number 617-27054. Bernard Madoff will be sentenced on June 16th. Prosecutors continue to investigate where the money is and who else might have been involved. Among the possible targets, his wife, Ruth. She is back at the couple's luxury penthouse, where now tonight she lives alone. Brian?
Scott Cohn, downtown Manhattan. Scott, thanks for that. Related story tonight, the downturn in the U.S. economy. A lot of news on this front today, including a new measure of the staggering job losses in this country. First-time requests for unemployment benefits rose to 654,000 just last week. That's on top of the 5.3 million already collecting unemployment. That's the largest number on record. And if we're all feeling poor, the Federal Reserve put some actual numbers on that today. It turns out the net worth of American households fell by $11.2 trillion in 2008, reflecting, among other things, the steep declines in the real estate and stock markets. Investors got a bit of that back today as the market rallied for a third straight session. The Dow gaining more than 239 points. Blue chips are up almost 10% for the week so far.